Great Lakes Now is sponsored by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation, nurturing environmentally healthy and culturally vibrant communities in metropolitan Detroit, and supporting initiatives to restore the Great Lakes Basin. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA leads a task force of 15 federal agencies and departments to implement the President's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And by the International Joint Commission, assessing progress, providing advice, and engaging the public under the U.S.-Canada Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us for Public Television's coverage of Great Lakes Week. I'm Christy McDonald. We are coming to you live from Detroit on the campus of Wayne State University, one of two locations for the conferences all of this week. And this is a first on a few levels. For the first time, government agencies, state, and environmental groups supporting the restoration of the Great Lakes from all around the basin are all meeting at the same time so they can share their ideas, things that have worked, maybe things that haven't worked, and compare agendas. The headlining groups here, the IJC, which is the International Joint Commission, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Great Lakes Commission, and Healing Our Waters Great Lakes. It is also a first for Detroit Public TV. It's the first time that we have extensively covered these conferences, so we're going to take you inside the sessions starting today through Friday. And you'll also be able to get in on the conversation, hear the science, a little debate. At night, we're going to have primetime shows for you, making sure you get the headlines from the day. We want to remind you that you can interact with us on social media as well. You can go to our Facebook page at Great Lakes Now, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Great Lakes Now as well. So if you want to get in a little on the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. This afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about several things with the conferences. So I have a couple of guests joining me right now. Gary Wilson, he's a commentator from the Great Lakes Echo. He's sitting over here on my left. And then closer to me right now is Nick Chirac. He's the executive director of Great Lakes Environmental Law Center here at Wayne State University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So Nick, let me start with you. How have you found things so far with the conference, and what are you looking forward to hearing in the next couple of days?
Well, it is very exciting to have all of the groups here, all the players in the same room, and we're getting excellent updates from not only the non-governmental organizations or environmental groups that are here, but also U.S. EPA and Environment Canada about all of the work that's going on around the Great Lakes.
And Gary, so far, what have you been able to kind of sniff out as the top issues?
Well, I think there's a lot of emphasis being placed and actually re-emphasis on these areas of concern, these toxic hotspots that are all around the lake. And some early word leaking out is that the EPA is going to kind of reinforce their mission to start cleaning up some of these areas.
Nick, let me kind of toss it over to you, where we talk a lot about there has to be regulation to make sure that the states in the Great Lake Basin are complying with some of the same rules to make sure that we can clean up the Great Lakes. What do you see as the biggest hurdle in all of that, coming from a law perspective?
Well, regulation is very important, but regulations are meaningless if they're not enforced. And what we oftentimes see is that with the way that our political system works, oftentimes industry groups have an outsized voice in these types of proceedings. So it's important for citizens, for the community, to really hold our regulators, so EPA, or in the state of Michigan, our Department of Environmental Quality, kind of hold their feet to the fire and make sure that they're enforcing the regulations we have on the books so that we don't have the kind of backsliding that we oftentimes see. And then beyond that, it's finding gaps or holes where there's improvement could be possible, and that's where we need to look at new legislation, new laws.
And looking at some of the issues surrounding the Great Lakes right now, what have you been spending most of your time on?
Invasive species are definitely a big issue. Everyone's heard about the Asian carp at this point, and but we also have other threats. Things like our changing land use patterns around the Great Lakes, where we're seeing more types of runoff from agriculture, but also from places that used to be forests or fields are now subdivisions. And so we have to deal with that kind of runoff into the Great Lakes. That's a big issue. And one other thing to flag, which hasn't really been brought up much yet, are chemicals of emerging concern. Things like pharmaceutical products, pesticides that are making their way into our Great Lakes and into our drinking water.
I want to back up and talk a little bit about invasive species, and I know that, Gary, that you've written about this extensively, and coming from Chicago and talking about Asian carp. Where are we right now with the battle, I guess you could say?
Well, the battle continues, and this first blew up not quite 2 years ago, and it's one of the stories that has really maintained traction. Sometimes issues that come up related to the Great Lakes are like sunspots. They're high intensity and then they leave. This has stayed in the news and stayed in the popular media, especially in Chicago. The states, led by Michigan, Attorney General Bill Schuette. Okay, he's leading the charge in the lawsuit against the Army Corps of Engineers in Chicago's Water District. They haven't had a victory yet to date in court, but they sort of had a minor victory in the appeals process, where I think the appeals court really kind of gave them some ammunition to go to the next level. So it's ongoing, and they don't appear to be backing off.
What do you think, Nick? I mean, this is where we're waging the battle in the water, but now this is really taking a pattern through the courts.
Right, and the thing that's important to note is that in our environmental law kind of toolbox of regulations that we have, there isn't a great way to get at invasive species that are just making their way through a water body. The Clean Water Act deals with discharges of pollution from a pipe. So if you had an invasive species being discharged off of a ship or out of a pipe, well, then we can get at it through the Clean Water Act. But here, what's been really interesting is watching Michigan and the other states look at common law claims. So common law, this is sort of the old traditions that were passed on from Roman law to English law into our system here in the United States. And what Michigan has argued is that Asian carp coming into the Great Lakes poses a threat of a public nuisance. And so that public nuisance, the way to stop it is to keep the carp from coming into Lake Michigan. That's what they've been arguing. The difficulty is sort of weighing that threat of Asian carp being established versus commerce and goods moving up and down the Chicago lock system.
Because people complain, we don't want to get in the way of making sure that people are able to make money and conduct business the way they need to do it.
I would add, separate from the law, when you hear the discourse between people in Illinois and Chicago and Indiana and people in Michigan and Wisconsin and other Great Lakes states, it's like one group is speaking English and the other group is speaking Russian. It's kind of like, what's the big deal? We've got these locks and some carp. What's the point? And clearly Michigan and the other states don't see it that way. That's why we're in court.
What I also find interesting is when you look at some of the laws that are on the books right now, you would think that if everyone's coming from the same place of we want to protect the Great Lakes, we want to make sure that they maintain the great resource that they are right now, that the laws aren't the same across the board, that the states sometimes have different regulations. And we were just talking about a news story that came out from the Great Lakes Commission that they're renewing their call for federal ballast discharge standards. And for people at home who might be saying, what are federal ballast discharge? And explain to me the ballast water and the discharge coming from the boats and bringing in invasive species and why it's not the same across the board.
Right. So ships going back to the beginning of our maritime history use ballast weight to stabilize the ships as they're traveling in the water. So modern vessels, what they do is they draw in water to stabilize their hold when they don't have cargo in it. So what you'll see is a ship taking on water, could be in Eastern Europe, then traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and making its way into the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway. Then they would discharge that water when they start to bring on cargo to keep their ship relatively stable. And within that ballast water, any sort of organisms, invasive species, all sorts of stuff can be carried into the Great Lakes region. So we've had a series of states take a step at getting at the ballast water issue through passing state legislation. The problem is we have 8 states in the Great Lakes, we have 2 Canadian provinces, and if they all pass separate laws, it's very difficult not only for enforcement, but also for the shipping industry to comply with all those different regulations.
So to me, Gary, it would seem to make sense that it all seems to make sense that we're all after the same thing here. How come we don't have a federal law?
Boy, that's a good question. And I would add to Nick's comment that the states a few years ago started taking action because the federal government didn't. Everybody agrees that there should be a uniform standard. Environmental groups, shipping groups, everybody. But the federal government just hasn't taken the action, and the states felt compelled to move, and they did.
I want to touch a little bit about, we talk about invasive species. Another thing that I think is a hot button issue for people when they hear about the Great Lakes, they think about fish and they think about mercury. What is the latest on protecting the waterways and the fish from that? And from a legal perspective, Nick, what are you working on?
Well, Administrator Lisa P. Jackson, the EPA administrator, spoke. She addressed the conference today, and she reiterated her call for stricter mercury emissions limits from coal-fired power plants. Folks may not realize we get the vast majority of our electricity, not only in Michigan, but in the Great Lakes region, from coal plants. And when we burn coal, one of the emissions is mercury. It makes its way into the atmosphere, falls down as rain into our lakes and rivers as mercury, and then it accumulates in aquatic organisms, then into fish populations. So we kind of look at this from a couple levels, but the main one is that we need to transition away from building new coal plants as a way to power our homes and our businesses moving forward. We need to look at other sources of energy that are less toxic. The other thing is making sure that while we have some regulations right now, we do need stricter pollution controls on smokestacks that are already existing to make sure that we continue to ratchet down those levels of mercury.
Now we're getting into the politics of it all, though, Gary.
Yet in Michigan, Governor Snyder, his administration anyway, just reversed the Granholm administration and issued a new permit for a coal-fired power plant. So I guess the question is, how do we ever get the mercury out of the water if we're going to keep issuing permits for coal-fired power plants? And I know there's litigation that was just filed by two groups.
Right. Sierra Club and NRDC have sued the state of Michigan over this permit for this Wolverine power plant. There's also a couple other proposals floating out there, one in Holland, Michigan. And so the question is whether or not the state is serious about transitioning to a clean energy economy, or whether we're going to continue to use technologies that really date back a couple centuries. And those technologies are dirty. And another important thing to note is it's very expensive to build these types of facilities. We're talking billions of dollars, and that cost gets passed on to ratepayers. And that's money that could be used for all sorts of other environmental cleanup, pollution controls, that type of thing.
And it would seem to me that anything that's going to cost more in the short term, people all of a sudden balk very quickly. And is that cost is going to be passed along to me. I don't want to pay more right now. It would also seem that the wheel turns very, very slowly when it comes to those new energies and to selling that publicly, that people are actually going to buy that.
Right. And an important thing to note, though, is we don't have to pay for wind. We don't have to pay for sunlight. So if we can harness those sources of power, that's going to ultimately save many, many billions of dollars over the course of generations. You look at the cost of coal, it continues to increase. So we're paying more. In Michigan, we don't have coal deposits. So we're importing all the coal. We're paying it to come from somewhere else. And then we're also dealing with the legacy of those pollutants, again, for generations. So it is time to make that transition. It's difficult. Folks are always a little concerned when we talk about new technologies. But again, wind is free. Sunlight's free, and we have to transition to those sources.
Nick, is this the classic old jobs versus the environment? If we build this plant, we're going to hire so many people to do it. And I thought we would kind of moved away from that model, but I don't think we have.
Locally, when you look at a proposal for a large facility to come in and you're talking hundreds of jobs, that's always a very difficult argument to refute just on environmental grounds. So what's been a big transition in the environmental community is to say, well, wait a minute, what about all the jobs that are created by folks building wind turbines? We have this huge manufacturing base here in the Midwest. We've got skilled trades that are out of work. How about putting those folks to work on building wind turbines or large solar installations? And so you now see studies where there's so many economic benefits to transitioning to clean energy, and a lot of those jobs for building a coal plant, they're temporary construction jobs. Right. Once the plant comes up and it's operating, it's a lot fewer people working. So with renewable energy, you have to always continue to maintain the facilities, maintain the wind turbines, so you're going to have jobs for a longer term.
I mean, and I've actually visited a couple of the wind farms up in the Thumb area and taken a look at that. But when it seemed like people started talking about, why don't we start doing some offshore and putting those wind turbines in the water, it got an awful lot of opposition to that.
Sure. The Great Lakes are held in what's called the public trust. Right, our legislatures are charged with keeping the Great Lakes, protecting them for future generations, and the public owns the bottomlands of the Great Lakes. So to just say, okay, the state of Michigan, for instance, is going to permit someone to go out and put a wind turbine out in the Great Lakes, it raises a whole host of issues which we're not ready to address yet.
And we're not going to do it today because we'd be here 4 more days from now. But thanks, Nick Schrock. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank
also,
you.
as always, Gary Wilson, commentator for the Great Lakes Echo. We are going to continue our live coverage now of Great Lakes Now, right here on public television. We'll take you back live into the joint session.